I had never imagined an occasion in which anything I had to say or think would have any serious bearing on what went on in the world. I can't say that changed by many magnitudes, but it did change. I did feel as if I had been close to something that was in the long term very important. And time has, in a way, borne that out, but not in the directions I had hoped. Ooh. I remember having had a three-wheeled trike, we call it, a three-wheeled bicycle when I was very little, but I didn't have it very long because we had to put it in storage and we went on the road with my father. My father was actually very well read. He had withdrawn from high school in the first year of high school. Going through all the years of schooling was not a very popular thing to do in New York in those years. And he couldn't wait to get out and become employed. And then he was no sooner that than he was in the Army in the First World War. And no sooner back home than married. My mother was very good at drawing and she could have painted. She always complained that she had no originality and couldn't do that sort of thing. But in terms of her manual skills, she was really very good. I picked some of this up from her, and I did become passionately involved in drawing and painting, and did a lot of that in the early years of primary education. And I even imagined I was going to be an artist, but there were several problems with that. My aunt, my mother's sister, married an artist who was having a terrible time. He eventually became quite well known, but it wasn't until he was well into his 50s. And in the meantime, his advice to me was, there's nothing wrong with being an artist as long as you are persuaded there's nothing else you would ever succeed at. And I began taking his advice seriously, particularly during those Depression years. That was beginning to be a rather dark time. It was very difficult to get employment of any sort. There were literal armies of unemployed people in New York. My father was young and energetic, and he managed always to have a job of some sort during the Depression years. But it was on occasion touch and go. And for other relatives of ours, it was strictly no-go. In fact, all through the 1930s, it only brightened a bit faintly. A rather cynical observation is that the U.S. didn't really get moving again until it was a matter of arming the country just shortly before the Second World War.
It's true. On September the 1st, 1939, the Nazi army smashed into Poland.
War had already begun on my 14th birthday in 1939, September 1st. Everything was pointing toward the eventual involvement of America beside the European powers in fighting the Second World War. Now, when I entered college, I happened, rather fortunately, to be a couple of years ahead in mathematics and some other things. And this was immediately a period at the end of 1939 in which all of the discussion was of enlisting scientists in the war effort, and one by one, our teachers disappeared. They announced that the advanced courses would in fact just be given for the last time, so the only opportunity to get those was to take them immediately. During that time, I filled out a questionnaire for something called the National Roster of Scientific Personnel. That was a sort of inquiry that was being made about the training background of individuals. They had the thought that they might be able to put them in the most appropriate places. I checked the boxes for the courses I had had, and all I knew then was that about a month later, there was a man dressed in black who showed up in the lab. He drew me into a room which was, in those years, deserted. It was only used for faculty meetings, and there weren't any faculty meetings. But the blinds were drawn. It was very dark in there. And he would tell me virtually nothing about what it was that interested him. He just said, there is a project. The only thing he would tell me was that it was out west. The Santa Fe Railroad doesn't go through Santa Fe. The closest it comes is the town of Laney, which is about 10 or 15 miles away. And I got on that train, and it was really quite a remarkable ride in that this was a part of the country I had never seen before. My father had only driven us around the east. Indiana is about the furthest west we had ever gotten. There was only a wooden platform there that one walked down, and as I did, there was a man, a short man with a round face and wearing a derby hat and a dark blue overcoat. And he introduced himself to me as Mr. Newman. There was a chap who had come to meet him, and very likely me too, who, as well as I could tell, was a real cowboy. He had a 10-gallon hat, a checked shirt, and dungarees. I didn't learn who the cowboy was, but he was to be our chauffeur again, driving the remaining distance, about another 30 miles. During this time, there was a fantastic kind of dialogue between the cowboy and Mr. Newman. Mr. Newman asked how things were going up there, and the cowboy said rather poorly, "Are following the world lines and find that they are beginning to intersect." And, well, this was relativistic terminology, and I was wondering what in the world could be going on. Whatever it was, it would have to be completely out of this world. The next day, I was led into the technical area, which was a fenced-off area within the fenced area that constituted the entire project. One had to show IDs to go in at all. But all of this was somehow prepared when I had come, and so that first day I was introduced to various people, including the head of the experimental physics division, which was Professor Robert Bacher. He was curious to find out what I had been able to gather about what they were doing just from what I heard in the East. And indeed, I had picked up stories of all sorts, I'd have to say most of which were in fact false. But I had concluded that they must be working, mainly because of the disappearance of this story already in 1939, that they must be working on a chain reaction somehow involving uranium-235. He wanted to know what I thought they were doing, and I told him that was my best guess. And he said, "Well, isn't that interesting? Because we've already done that. That was done a little over a year ago in Chicago. But we're also working on a chain reaction. But this would be not a slow chain reaction, but a fast one. And in fact, we're working on a bomb."
If there is fission with very serious upset of the nuclear structure, it is not improbable that some neutrons will be evaporated. And if some neutrons are evaporated, then they might be more than one, let's say for the sake of argument 2. And if they are more than one, it may be that the two of them, for example, may each one cause a fission, and from that one sees, of course, the beginning of the chain reaction.
That really was a bit of a disappointment, I'd have to say. To me, I didn't have any thought that they would be working that soon or that precipitously on a weapon potentially that destructive. It took a long time to become accustomed to that, but it didn't take very much reading of the newspapers. Germany was in the ascendant in those days. They had engaged in the most awful bombing campaign over Britain. It was clear that the Germans implicitly knew, it appeared they knew, must know everything that we knew about it. So it was, in effect, a race to perfect the weapon. And indeed, it would be quite an awful thing if the Germans succeeded in getting there first, because what they were doing with the V2 and V1 rockets made it perfectly clear that they would have no hesitation whatever in using the weapon once they had reached it. So those thoughts were echoing all the time in the next weeks, and it took some weeks, maybe months, before I was reconciled to what we were in fact doing, but I was pretty well convinced over that period. As we go on, this I have to tell you is General Groves. General Groves was in many ways a remarkable man. He was an expert at procurement for the Army, and he had some remarkable procurement problems, as I'll explain. He saw always the image of himself being crucified for the failure of the project. And for that reason, he would never, for example, give us any way of anything that looked like sidewalks. We had to walk in mud sometimes up to our ankles because the Army could not afford the luxury of sidewalks at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer, on the other hand, spoke another language entirely, and it was a language which was deeply appreciated by the physicists. Oppenheimer was, in his way, a remarkable person. He was an intellectual's intellect. First of all, his understanding of modern physics was excellent. He had a beautiful use of English, and he tried to be just as reasonable as he could be. I can't recall ever seeing him angry. As a candidate to direct Los Alamos, he was a number one choice, not because of any of the virtues I've mentioned, but simply because he was born in the USA. That was considered an absolutely necessary condition by the general. The two of them constituted a sort of joint personality, a double personality in running the project. They could speak to one another. Groves, by some exercise of imagination, managed to trust Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer, by some exercise of poetry or whatever it was, managed to persuade Groves of the need to do various things. Together they functioned in a way that no single individual could have. There was a sense in which it was a kind of ideal and very comfortable place to live, because the only thing that really counted was the intellectual life within the technical area and at the dinner tables after it. The climate was just about perfect. It had 4 seasons, and they were all of them beautiful in their way. The country was an inspiration to look at. Of course, there were just a few luxuries that were missing, but it was an extremely comfortable life, and all we had to do was to work, in the case of the theorists, to produce intellectual terms. The experimenters, on the other hand, had to go off to their respective mesas and blow up whatever things they had to in order to try to investigate the ways in which the bomb might be assembled. The number of scientists when I got there, which was late 43, the beginning of 44, was only about a couple of hundred. That number expanded considerably, and it must have been up closer to 1,000 by the time the war was over. I would say the average age was in the mid-20s. The grand old men of the project were as old as 37, 38. Beta, for example, Weishaupt, Oppenheimer. These were people in their late 30s, and who, for the most part, were people who had just missed the great quantum mechanical revolution in 1925 and 26. They were the people who came along 1 or 2 years later and never really had their turn at bat, as it were. They are the people who would have written the epoch-making papers that changed the theory of the atom and that introduced quantum mechanics. They never had as great an opportunity, but they were being given a second chance, in a sense, at this late date in the 1940s to lead this project. There were many of them, the ones who made it go. And the curious thing is that those people were close colleagues of people on the other side, like Heisenberg, and the several people who worked with him on the effort to produce the German bomb. Well, first a German reactor, which never worked, and then perhaps the German bomb, which never got very far at all.
In Europe, a cancer was spreading over mankind. The fascism of Germany, starting from hoodlumism, rose steadily to the murderous persecution of Jews and intellectuals. The luckiest ones escaped to America.
There were differences. The Europeans were typically a much more worldly lot. They had had a great deal more experience with war than the Americans. There were not very many Europeans among the younger people at all. They were the older people by and large. And I wouldn't say there was any real disagreement, but these worldly people didn't think that it was going to solve the world's problems. The Americans tended to be very much more hopeful that we were entering a new era. I chose to be in the theory division, having only college mathematics behind me. But we all worked quite hard, and long days, Saturdays no less. I think maybe Saturday was only a half a day for some, but people did work quite hard in that period. Of course, that was in contrast to what had taken place in the first couple of years after the announcement to President Roosevelt that there was a danger. That was, of course, included in a letter that Leo Szilard actually wrote and which was signed by Einstein, delivered by a banker to Roosevelt, who took it seriously immediately. That was in August of 1939. And having taken it that seriously, this distinguished group of scientists began to appoint committees, and there was committee after committee, so that altogether there was a delay of something over 2 years before the first efforts were undertaken seriously during the war. It was only in the weeks just before the attack on Pearl Harbor that there began to be a project devoted to nuclear chain reactions. If we could, and indeed I can't imagine that we could not, have concluded the test of the bomb, have created it, in other words, a good year before we eventually did, It would have altered the course of the war in Europe. There would have been many thousands of lives saved there, and heaven knows in Japan as well. There were many disappointing experiments in the weeks and months before. I can tell you about them, and some just before the test, which were most discouraging of all. There was a pool held in Oppenheimer's office. His secretary kept careful track of a notebook in which people entered their bets. So there were bets that ranged from 1 or 2 tons of TNT, which was just what you needed in order to trigger the thing, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of tons of TNT, which were far more than was reasonable, but there were literally people who were afraid that the atmosphere was going to be set on fire. That pool was won by I. Robbie. He had made his estimate several days ahead, and the way he did it was to thumb through the book and find the largest single interval between 2 other bets. Robbie had picked something like 18,000 tons. The number that eventually emerged was close enough, 16,000, 14,000. We never really knew. So the question then was setting the whole thing up, making the measurements and the like, and quite a large team of experimental people went down there to set up equipment all over the desert floor around that area. They made it very clear, the security people, that they didn't want anybody there unnecessarily. That meant that the theorists were welcome to stay home. On the other hand, they did invite a certain number of big shots to witness the thing. The closest observers were 6 miles away from the center of the Trinity test. The hoi polloi, the other experimenters who had worked on this and felt a right to be there and to see the thing, were about 10 miles away. We were not in radio contact. We had no idea what they were doing. But a number of us got in cars and went south to Albuquerque, where there is quite a substantial mountain by the side of the city. You climb to 10,000 feet easily by car. And we sat there looking southward. The Trinity site was a good 100 miles away, and we sat there quite a long time. We saw clouds down there, we saw lightning flashes, there was a thunderstorm that postponed the whole business. The sky was eventually beginning to get a bit light around 5 in the morning, and many of my friends decided to pick up and go home. I was a little more determined to see whatever might happen than most of them, I think, because I just sat there staring in that direction. And around 5:30 in the morning, most of them were looking in altogether different directions, when suddenly the sun seemed to come up in the south.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
As we were moving toward the Trinity test, we decided that the bomb was something that should be discussed. And since we were about the only people who knew about it, we ought to be the ones doing the talking. Robert Wilson, if I remember correctly, went to Oppie and brought us back a message from Oppenheimer that we had better be very careful about this, and the best advice he could give us was to shut up and say absolutely nothing, that any word of this that reached the General Groves, would be very upsetting to him. There would certainly be nothing wrong with our discussing these things, but that we ought to put them off until closer to the Trinity test. I think that was the word, or perhaps after the Trinity test. The truth is, we did just that. We decided that it was too unstable a situation to begin talking about these things, and there was not another meeting held even after the Trinity test. That period, the 1 month period, wasn't 1 month, it was about 3 weeks, between the Trinity test and the use of the bomb on August 6th was an unearthly quiet period in which nobody said anything. There was no sense of fulfillment that I felt. I can't speak for others. There must have been people who felt it was some kind of fulfillment at Los Alamos. I felt it was the beginning of something new and awful, and that we were responsible, but maybe we'd have the good fortune to have stopped the war.
We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of the
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
When the announcement was made by Truman on August 6th There was immediately excitement, of course, at Los Alamos. Many people thought it was because we had some triumphal feelings. It wasn't true at all as far as the bomb and the killing was concerned. What happened was that we were suddenly on the map and permitted to communicate outside the project, and every one of us went to the office and sent telegrams or whatever messages we could back home to explain that that is the explanation of what we had been doing for the last several years. I sent such a message through, in effect, saying, that's me, folks, that's what I was doing. But they had not even heard the story yet and were, as a matter of fact, quite upset by the telegram, but it wasn't long before other people phoned them and before they heard the story, and I imagine they were proud. There was a feeling of exhilaration that now what we had been doing had some effect and we could talk about it. Did we talk about it? Well, again, we went to Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer had the feeling that everything is in good hands in Washington, and the best thing you can do is just remain quiet and restrict all communication to official channels. What we did do was to write a letter to the president expressing the hope for international control and saying what the dangers of anything else would be. That was quite a well-reasoned letter we wrote to Truman. And as a matter of fact, Truman, without using quotation marks, quoted a large part of what we wrote him intact. What ensued was, first of all, the Russian achievement of the nuclear bomb, which was a great shock to everyone. That wasn't supposed to happen for another 10 years or so. And a vastly renewed effort to create the hydrogen weapon, the thermonuclear reaction. Eventually, they felt that Oppenheimer, as a voice of reason in all of this, had to be done away with. And they held a loyalty proceeding in the 50s, a proceeding unlike any that has ever been held in America. It was a kind of reenactment of the biblical passion play.
One other key factor in our support of atomic strikes is definite knowledge of the yield and ground zero of our weapons.
Everything that could be done was done to embarrass Oppenheimer, and the judgment was presently reached, 2 votes out of 3, that Oppenheimer should have his loyalty clearance removed to take him away from all matters secret. You know the rest of the story. You know the Teller's great program to put nuclear weapons in orbit around the Earth, the Star Wars program, which was an absurdity, I'm afraid, from the very beginning. And within a couple of years, Oppenheimer really wasted away. He died, I think, ultimately of throat cancer, having smoked himself to death, among other things. International control of a power like that was very desirable at the beginning. The Russians immediately began working against it because it wasn't anything they would even consider seriously until they had reached the same landmark. And by that time, it was in a sense too late. I did love the place, mostly for its climate and the general atmosphere about it. So I waited all of those 3 months or so before getting back to New York and then going off to Cambridge.
Did you do any work there in those 3 months?
In those 3 months, not really very much was accomplished.
Did you miss the atmosphere and the kind of excitement there that was going on?
Well, I
Back to
certainly, I was back in the same sort of soup, you might say, that I had been in as an undergraduate, and I did feel as if I had quite outgrown that. On the other hand, there wasn't any way I could relate to other students at the time at Harvard, or even faculty for that matter, as somebody who had really been out there, out west, had taken part in all of that and had seen all of that. That was a rather strange contrast that I had to live through. And it took quite some months before I became at all accustomed to living without many of the contacts and excitements that we had had out there.
I'm sure things seemed like it was very quiet in
It
comparison.
seemed, that's right, and the ground never shook with explosions nearby. That's what it was like in the post-war world. It was, in other respects, I'd say, a kind of dull world. It didn't have any of the tension or anticipation that the idealist, this somewhat utopian world had at Los Alamos. In some ways, I was slow in developing after that. It was a long time before I got what I thought were any really good ideas. Eventually it happened.